There's something about Star Wars that works particularly well at this time of night. Not in a way that requires forward momentum or full attention, more in the way that it's a universe you've been living in for so long, and in so many formats and across so many years, that wandering back into it doesn't feel like effort. It just feels like settling into somewhere familiar. Tonight I want to walk through the Disney sequel trilogy, The Force Awakens, The Last Jedi, and The Rise of Skywalker. 3 films released between 2015 and 2019, which together were meant to close the Skywalker saga. The story George Lucas started in 1977, and which he spent, on and off, the better part of 4 decades building and expanding and occasionally revising in ways that made certain portions of the fanbase quite upset. It was a story that concluded in its original form with Return of the Jedi in 1983, and which most people assumed was finished. And then it wasn't. I should say up front that I'm not coming at this from a particularly angry place. I know that can feel surprising when the phrase Disney sequel trilogy comes up, because the discourse around these 3 films has been, to put it gently, fairly intense since about 2017. There are people who consider The Last Jedi a genuinely important piece of filmmaking, a bold creative choice in a franchise that too often plays it safe. There are people who consider it a catastrophe, and there are people who have been arguing about it at considerable length, without apparent signs of stopping, for the better part of 8 years. Which is actually quite impressive as a feat of sustained commitment. What I find more interesting than the argument itself is the question of how it got to be this way. How 3 films, made by talented people with enormous resources, inside one of the most beloved franchises in cinema history, ended up producing something that is genuinely entertaining in parts, often visually beautiful, full of good performances, and yet somehow doesn't hold together as a trilogy. The individual films have real merit. The whole is somehow less than the sum of its parts, and I find that more fascinating than frustrating. At this point, that's what tonight is. A fairly unhurried walk through the whole thing. We'll start with the Disney acquisition of Lucasfilm in 2012, which is really where this story begins, and with the foundational decisions that were made before a single frame of footage was shot. Then we'll go through each film in turn, thinking about what each one was trying to do and how that played out against what came before and after it. We'll look at the directors who were fired or who departed, because that pattern tells you something important about the creative environment. We'll spend some time with the new characters, who I think deserved better than the structure of these films was always able to give them. We'll look at what George Lucas was apparently planning before his ideas were set aside, and at the alternate version of Episode 9 that eventually leaked and turned out to be quite interesting. And at the end, we'll spend some time on what these films actually got right, because they did get things right. If this kind of late-night franchise archaeology is your thing, the subscribe button is there whenever you want it. Absolutely no pressure on that. Let's just settle in. One thought before we begin. I think it helps, going into all of this, to hold on to a sense of the scale of what was being attempted. The sequel trilogy was not just a set of films, it was the continuation of a mythology that had been shaping itself in the cultural imagination for nearly 40 years. It had to work for children seeing Star Wars for the very first time, and for adults who had grown up with Luke and Han and Leia as touchstones, as part of the furniture of their inner lives. It had to be commercially enormous and creatively credible. It had to satisfy people who loved the prequels and people who hated them, people who'd read every expanded universe novel, and people who'd never heard of any of that. That is, genuinely, a lot to manage, and I think keeping that context in mind makes a lot of what follows feel a bit more human and a bit less like anyone set out to make a mess. Right then, let's start with the deal. I should say, before we do, that I've spent quite a bit of time with these films recently, not out of anything like masochism, though I understand why you might read it that way. More because I find there are actually interesting things in all three of them, even the ones that frustrate me most, and I wanted to try to see them clearly before talking about them at length. There's something worth excavating here, about how large creative projects fail, about what happens when a corporation inherits a mythology, about the gap between what filmmakers intend and what audiences receive, and also just about Star Wars as a thing. What it actually is, what Lucas built and what he meant by it. I think one of the quieter problems with the sequel trilogy is that the people making it had a somewhat different answer to that question than Lucas did. Not necessarily a wrong answer, but a different one. And that difference ended up mattering quite a lot. Alright, let's go. To understand the sequel trilogy, you need to go back to a point before any of these films existed. Quite a long way back, actually. George Lucas made the prequel trilogy across the late 90s and early 2000s. The Phantom Menace, Attack of the Clones, Revenge of the Sith. 3 films he'd been planning for decades, which told the story of how Anakin Skywalker became Darth Vader, and which he'd been insisting weren't coming for years before he finally made them. The prequels came out between 1999 and 2005. Their reception is its own complicated story, and one I'd genuinely like to sit with in a separate video someday. The short version is, they were enormous hits commercially, beloved by a generation of kids who grew up with them as their Star Wars, and also the subject of significant criticism from a portion of the older fan base who'd been expecting something tonally closer to the original trilogy. Lucas found the experience of making them, and particularly the experience of the backlash that followed some of his creative choices, fairly wearing. By the time Revenge of the Sith came out in 2005, he was saying regularly, and with some emphasis, that Star Wars was a 6-film story. Anakin Skywalker's rise and fall. That was it. Done. He'd also been saying, for years before the prequels even started, that there would be no sequel trilogy. He changed that position a few times over the decades, as it happens. But by the mid-2000s, the settled position seemed to be 6 films, end of story. And then gradually, he changed his mind again. Partly, this appears to have been about age. Lucas was 68 in 2012. He'd been talking about retirement for a while, about stepping back from big studio productions and returning to the kind of smaller, more personal filmmaking that he'd wanted to do before Star Wars consumed the better part of his professional life. He had a daughter born in 2013. He was thinking about what happened next, in various senses, and somewhere in that thinking, he started to consider what Lucasfilm would become after him, and what might happen to the story he'd built. He began developing sequel trilogy treatments, put together a small team, started working on outlines for what episodes 7, 8 and 9 might actually be. The moment that eventually led to the deal happened in May 2011. Lucas was in Florida for the opening of Star Tours. The adventures continue at Walt Disney World. Disney CEO Bob Iger invited him to breakfast and asked, fairly directly, whether he'd consider selling Lucasfilm. Lucas wasn't ready at that point. He said no and went home. By June 2012, he'd changed his mind. He reached out to Iger. What followed was 5 months of acquisition negotiations, during which Lucas worked to ensure that key Lucasfilm personnel would stay on, and during which he eventually presented his sequel trilogy treatments to Disney's leadership. Disney agreed that the stories showed potential, and on October 30, 2012, the acquisition was officially announced. Disney paid $4.05 billion for Lucasfilm in cash and stock. Kathleen Kennedy, whom Lucas had been preparing to hand leadership to anyway, became president of the company. And Episode 7 was announced, scheduled for 2015. 2.5 years away for a film of this scale, at the centre of this franchise, with this much commercial pressure attached to it. That's tight. Kathleen Kennedy brought an extraordinary track record to the position. she'd produced some of the most critically and commercially successful films of the past 30 years. Spielberg films, Oscar winners, genuine pieces of cinema history. But there's a meaningful difference between producing individual films, even exceptional ones, and building and managing a franchise universe. The structural and creative demands are different, and the circumstances of this particular job, the timeline, the audience expectations, the size of the mythology she was inheriting, were quite unlike anything she'd overseen before. Now, what we know about Lucas's sequel treatments comes from a combination of sources, things he said in interviews over the years, notably in a documentary series James Cameron made for AMC around 2018 called Story of Science Fiction, in which Lucas spoke at some length about his plans. From there, and from various other interviews he's given, a picture emerges of a sequel trilogy that was going to be quite different from what we eventually got. Lucas's version was apparently centered on a young female Jedi student being trained by an older Luke Skywalker. He described her in some detail in the Cameron documentary. The character's early name in the treatments was Kira, and you can see traces of her in who Rey eventually became. There was also a second young protagonist, male, who in at least some versions of the outline had connections to Han and Leia and had fallen to the dark side. Something of that character survived in the development process as Kylo Ren. But the overall tone was apparently something quite different from what we got. Lucas had been interested for years in what he described as the microbiotic world of the Force, the deeper metaphysical layer of what the Force actually is. This connects to the concept of midichlorians introduced in The Phantom Menace and widely criticised by fans who felt it demystified the Force by giving it a biological explanation. His sequels, it seems, were going to lean further into that territory rather than away from it. He described the planned tone as more ethereal, less focused on large-scale galactic conflict, more interested in internal and spiritual dimensions. I find this quite interesting because it means that Lucas, at the moment he was planning the sequel trilogy, was moving toward exactly the kind of Star Wars that the post-prequel critical consensus had been insisting he shouldn't make. More internal, more metaphysical, more interested in ideas than action. Whether that would have been good or not, I don't know, but it would have been distinctive. It would have been his. What Lucas apparently believed was that presenting his treatments to Disney amounted to something like a promise that they'd be used as the foundation for what came next. What actually happened was different. J.J. Abrams, when he was hired to write and direct Episode 7, was reportedly given a mandate to discard Lucas's story outlines and start from scratch. According to various accounts, Disney wanted something that felt more immediately appealing to a broad audience, less ethereal, more familiar. Lucas found this out in 2015 when The Force Awakens was about to be released. In an interview with Charlie Rose, he compared selling Lucasfilm to a divorce. In another context, he referred to Disney as white slavers, a phrase he subsequently apologized for, but which gives you a sense of how raw the experience felt to him. He felt betrayed. He'd sold the thing he'd built, in part because he'd believed his vision for what came next would be respected. It wasn't. Meanwhile, in April 2014, Lucasfilm made another significant decision. The entire Star Wars expanded universe, the decades of novels, comics, and games that had constructed an elaborate post-return of the JEDI continuity since the early 1990s, was declared non-canonical, rebranded as Star Wars Legends. The new films would not be bound by it. The practical reason given was creative freedom, which is understandable on its face. You can't ask filmmakers to work within a continuity built from hundreds of novels they haven't read and storylines that would significantly constrain where they could take the characters. But for the fans who had grown up inside the Legends continuity, who had years invested in characters and storylines that were now being set aside, it was significant. It contributed to a sense in the early years of the new Disney-era Lucasfilm clearing the table rather than building on what was there. And here's the piece of the structural setup that I think matters most, and that I want to sit with for a moment before we move on to the actual films. Before a single script had been written, before a director had been locked in for more than episode 7, before a single creative decision had been made about the shape of the trilogy as a whole, the sequel trilogy was already missing something essential. There was no story Bible, no agreed overarching plan, no shared understanding of where the trilogy was going, what it was trying to say, or what the 3 films needed to accomplish together. Each director would be hired to make their own film. The connections would be worked out as they went along. What you got in this scenario is not one story told in 3 chapters. What you get is 3 different filmmakers, each making their own version of a story, one after another, in ways that don't necessarily cohere. Marvel Studios, which had been building its own interconnected universe since 2008, worked from extensive shared planning and a long-term roadmap. The people making individual Marvel films knew what ground they were covering, what they needed to set up for the next film, what had been established by the films before. The sequel trilogy had none of that architecture. Kathleen Kennedy's stated philosophy was about giving creative filmmakers freedom. That's not a bad philosophy for individual films. It's a much harder philosophy to apply to a connected trilogy, where the choices one director makes create the conditions the next director has to work in. And without an agreed destination, without a clear sense of what the trilogy was moving toward, those choices can compound in ways nobody fully anticipated. I keep coming back to this as the foundational thing, because I think it explains almost everything that follows. Not everything, certainly, but quite a lot. Let's talk about the first film. The Force Awakens came out December 18th, 2015, and I remember the anticipation around that release being unlike almost anything I can easily compare it to. Star Wars, back, new characters, new story, the original cast returning, a proper theatrical release with a proper orchestral score and practical effects, and a Millennium Falcon doing what the Millennium Falcon does. The teaser trailer with the TIE fighters banking over the desert. The second trailer with the Falcon rising out of the sand and Han Solo standing in the doorway, saying, "Chewie, we're home." It all worked, more or less. The marketing was close to the best version of what film marketing can do. And the film itself, in many respects, delivered on the feeling those trailers promised. The Force Awakens is a genuinely enjoyable film. I want to be clear about that before anything else. The new characters work. Daisy Ridley and John Boyega have real earned screen presence, and the film is smart enough to build an extended opening sequence around them before any familiar faces show up. They have to carry the first act almost entirely on their own, and they do it. Oscar Isaac makes Poe Dameron instantly, effortlessly likeable in the way that certain actors can just switch on. Adam Driver gives Kylo Ren a peculiar, unstable quality, a kind of anguished volatility that makes him considerably more interesting than a simple villain would have been. I could sit down and watch The Force Awakens tonight and have a thoroughly fine time with it. I want to say that clearly, because what I'm about to get into are the structural decisions the film makes that created problems for what came after it, and those problems don't invalidate what works. J.J. Abrams has talked over the years about what he calls the mystery box. The concept is fairly simple. A story is more compelling when it's asking questions than when it's answering them. The anticipation of an answer is more engaging than the answer itself. The box, whatever's inside it, is less interesting once you've opened it. Abrams used this approach on Lost, on Cloverfield, on his Star Trek reboots, on Super 8. He's genuinely very good at creating the feeling of irresistible mystery. What the mystery box approach requires, though, is that someone, at some point, has to open the boxes, and the answers have to be worth the anticipation. This is where Abrams is less reliably good. And it's where the structure of the sequel trilogy as a whole created a particular problem, because Abrams was opening boxes that he had no intention of answering himself. He was leaving them for Rian Johnson, who had his own ideas about what should be inside them. The Force Awakens raises a substantial list of questions. Who is Supreme Leader Snoke? Where did he come from? What happened at Luke's new Jedi Academy that led to its destruction? Who are Rey's parents, and why was she left on Jakku? What exactly is the First Order in relationship to the Fallen Empire? How does Finn's vague Force sensitivity fit into the story? What is the Knights of Ren, the group Kylo leads, and whose other members are glimpsed briefly in a vision and then never mentioned again? These are interesting questions, and the film is constructed around the feeling of those questions being asked, which is part of why it stays engaging while you're watching it. There's a real pull to the mystery, and that pull is doing a lot of work. The problem is that by the time Rian Johnson read the script and began developing The Last Jedi, he was under no obligation to answer any of these questions in the way Abrams had, consciously or unconsciously, imagined they might be answered. Johnson had his own vision for the story, and he answered some of the questions in ways that were surprising, and others in ways that were deliberately deflating. And one, Snoke's identity, he chose simply not to answer at all. The film is, quite explicitly, a structural echo of A New Hope. Orphan on a desert planet who turns out to be more important than they know. A small spherical droid carrying secret information. An old mentor figure who dies at a pivotal moment. A planet-destroying superweapon, this one larger than a Death Star. The ragtag resistance, the overwhelming enemy armada. The final desperate attack run. Even the details rhyme. The cantina. The moment where the villain removes his mask to reveal a human face. These parallels are not accidental. Abrams has spoken about the brief he was given, which was to return Star Wars to the feeling of the original trilogy. And he did that. He did it quite skillfully, actually. The film feels like Star Wars in a way that matters and that audiences responded to. The 93% critic score it earned on Rotten Tomatoes reflects something real about its craft and its entertainment value. But George Lucas, when he eventually saw the finished film, said it had nothing new. He felt it was too backward-looking, and I think that's a fair point, even if I'd frame it differently than Lucas did. What The Force Awakens decided was that the best way to revive the franchise was to recreate the feeling of encountering Star Wars for the first time. And in doing so, it made some choices that worked beautifully in the moment, but created a fragile foundation for what followed. The biggest of these is what it does to Han Solo. Harrison Ford is wonderful in this film, I should say that up front. He steps back into the character without a flicker of awkwardness, and there's something about seeing him in that cockpit again that is, whatever else you think about the film, genuinely moving. But the version of Han Solo we meet in The Force Awakens is an estranged widower, separated from Leia, back to smuggling, barely keeping his ship together. He's lost his relationship, he's lost his place in the rebellion, he's lost his son to the dark side. All of his character development across the original trilogy, the reluctant hero who found something worth fighting for, the man who built a life, the general who helped liberate the galaxy, is effectively reversed. Han is a 66-year-old man in the process of losing everything. This is done so that his death, killed by his own son on a catwalk over a vast drop, can land with the weight it's meant to carry. And it does land. It's a devastating scene. But to get there, the film had to untell his story. I think that cost is worth acknowledging. A parallel, though different, thing happens with Luke Skywalker, who is notably absent for almost the entire film. He's gone into hiding. He's lost. The emotional centre of the film's ending is the discovery of where he is and that final image of him standing on a cliff on a remote island, turning to face Rey. It's a beautiful image, and it sets up what should be a powerful storyline about what happens when you find a broken version of someone who was once invincible. I want to spend a moment on what The Force Awakens does that I think gets undervalued in all the subsequent discourse about what came after it. The opening act of the film, before the familiar characters arrive, is quietly excellent. The extended sequences of Rey on Jakku, the rhythm of her daily life, the scavenging, the cooking, the counting portions at the end of the day are patient and character-led in a way that the rest of the trilogy sometimes forgets to be. The film trusts you to be interested in this person before she does anything particularly significant. And the early Finn sequences, the moment where he refuses to participate in the massacre at the film's opening, the dawning realization of what he's doing and what it will cost him, are handled with real economy. Two significant characters introduced without dialogue from either of them in a few minutes of screen time. There's real craft in those early scenes. The film earns its central characters, which is more than can be said for every franchise reboot. And that craft is part of why the structural problems that develop later feel like something of a loss. Finn's Force sensitivity, for instance, it's briefly alluded to in the film. He can hear things, feel things, in ways that suggest a connection to the Force, and then it's simply not developed in any of the subsequent films. It gets a passing mention in Rise of Skywalker, and then disappears again. This is a character idea that's set up and then abandoned, and it's a small example of a larger pattern. The Force Awakens ends with the new characters established, a new threat introduced, the old order gone, Han is dead, Luke is found but broken, Leia is a general again, but a desperate one, and an enormous number of questions open. A 93% critical score, a box office haul of over $2 billion, and a fan base that is, broadly speaking, delighted and excited. Everything was in place. The launch was successful. All that had to happen now was to figure out where the story was actually going. And that was the parts that nobody had quite worked out. One other thing about TFA that's worth noting before we move on: the decision to make Kylo Ren a conflicted villain rather than a purely evil one was one of the best creative choices in the trilogy. The original trilogy's villain was Darth Vader, who was terrifying partly because he was so complete, so certain. Kylo Ren, by contrast, is someone who is actively uncertain about himself, who is performing his own darkness and not always convincingly, who is in some sense still Ben Solo trying to become Kylo Ren. That's a more contemporary kind of villain, and it created a relationship with Rey that was genuinely novel in the franchise. I think it's fair to say that The Force Awakens planted better seeds than the gardeners who came after it were given the same vision of what the garden should become. Some of what it planted grew into something real. Some of it was pulled up and replanted elsewhere, and some of it just didn't get the attention it needed, but the seeds were good. When Rian Johnson was announced as the writer and director of Episode 8, the expectation, I think, was something fairly conventional. A middle chapter, expand the universe a bit, answer some of The Force Awakens' questions, set up the pieces for the finale. The Empire Strikes Back model, if you like, though nobody seemed to have thought through what made Empire work as a middle chapter in the specific way it did. Johnson had other plans. Episode 8, The Last Jedi, came out December 15, 2017. It made $1.33 billion at the worldwide box office. Its critic score on Rotten Tomatoes is 91%. Its audience score is 42%. That gap, 91% from professional critics and 42% from the general audience, is one of the largest splits ever recorded for a major blockbuster release. And that number alone tells you something quite specific about what kind of film it is. It pleased people who evaluate films in terms of craft, originality, and thematic ambition. It upset people who measure films by whether they deliver what they came for. Both reactions are coherent, both are defensible. And I find I have something like sympathy for both camps, which is a slightly uncomfortable position to occupy. Johnson's stated approach to the material was what he called subverting expectations, finding what the film seemed to be setting up, based on what TFA had established, and going somewhere different, going somewhere the audience hadn't anticipated. He's talked about asking himself, when approaching each scene, what the audience expects to happen here, and then asking whether there's a more interesting answer. In principle, that's a reasonable creative philosophy. The best films often are the ones that refuse to do what you expect. The problem, or one of the problems, is that subverting expectations only works if you're subverting towards something. If the unexpected choice is in service of a deeper truth or a stronger emotional logic, it can be revelatory. If it's subverting for the sake of surprise itself, the effect becomes deflating rather than illuminating. The Last Jedi does both, at different points. Let's start with Luke Skywalker because it's the decision that most sharply divided people, and because I think it deserves to be taken seriously rather than dismissed. The version of Luke we meet in The Last Jedi is a broken man living in exile. He's been on a remote island for years, having cut himself off from the Force, having abandoned the Jedi tradition he was trained in. The reason, which the film reveals across its runtime, is that he briefly considered killing his nephew, Ben Solo, while Ben slept, seeing a darkness in the boy that he feared he couldn't contain. He raised his lightsaber, then he couldn't do it. Ben woke up, saw his uncle standing over him with a weapon, and the betrayal of that moment tipped him toward the dark side. This is not a Luke Skywalker anyone expected to meet. The argument for this version of Luke is actually quite compelling, if you're willing to sit with it. Real people crack under impossible pressure. The mythology of the unbroken hero who never fails, who never lets fear win, who is always the person we need him to be, is a mythology. It's not how anyone actually lives. Johnson is trying to tell a story about what it does to a person to be Luke Skywalker for 30 years, about the weight of a legend, about what happens when someone who is supposed to be a symbol of hope finds themselves staring into the darkness of someone they love, and for a moment, just a moment, choosing wrong. That's interesting material. That's the kind of thing that could produce a genuinely moving story. The argument against, and it's a serious argument, is that the Luke Skywalker, established in the original trilogy, is someone who refused to give up on his father at the moment of absolute darkness, who won the Battle of Endor by throwing away his weapon and accepting death rather than fight, who chose redemption over violence in the most extreme circumstances imaginable. The suggestion that this same person would raise a lightsaber over a sleeping child, even for a moment, even in terror, felt to a great many people like a violation of who the character is. Mark Hamill, in an interview that circulated widely at the time, said he had fundamentally disagreed with Johnson's interpretation of Luke. He later softened that, saying he'd come to respect what Johnson was trying to do, and that his initial reaction was about his own protectiveness of the character, rather than the filmmaking being wrong. But his instinct, the thing he felt before he talked himself into being diplomatic about it, is worth taking seriously. He knew the character. The Last Jedi also makes a significant decision about Snoke. Supreme Leader Snoke, who had been built up throughout The Force Awakens as a major villain, an enormous hologram with a scarred face and evident power, is killed about halfway through The Last Jedi. Abruptly, with a lightsaber trick, by Kylo Ren, during what should have been a throne room confrontation scene. He dies with no explanation of who he was, where he came from, how he rose to lead the First Order, or what his larger plans were for the galaxy. Johnson's position, as I understand it, is that Snoke's mystery was never going to produce a satisfying answer. Any explanation would be less interesting than the question, and keeping him alive would mean making the film's central story about Snoke, rather than about Kylo Ren, who is the more interesting character. So he killed him. As a decision in isolation, this is defensible. as a decision within a trilogy, it created a problem. Because The Force Awakens had clearly presented Snoke as someone significant, as someone with a history, as the person pulling the strings behind the destruction of Luke's Jedi Order and the rise of the First Order. Audiences had invested in the mystery, and he just dies inexplicably halfway through the second film is a resolution that requires a certain tolerance for anticlimaxes. The Rise of Skywalker would attempt to address this by making Snoke a creation of Emperor Palpatine, but that answer arrives in a different film and produces its own questions. And then there's Rey's parents. The Force Awakens had set up her parentage as a central mystery, placing considerable emotional weight on the question of who she is and where she comes from. The Last Jedi's answer, delivered through Kylo Ren in a moment of psychological pressure, is that her parents were nobodies, junk traders, people who sold her for drinking money when she was small. She doesn't come from anyone special. She doesn't have a significant bloodline. She is simply herself. This is, as a thematic choice, coherent with something Johnson was trying to say throughout the film, that heroism and connection to the Force don't require special lineage. Anyone can matter. The next generation of Jedi doesn't have to emerge from an existing dynasty. The Force belongs to everyone. It's actually an interesting idea, and one that connects, as I'll mention later, to things Lucas himself had been saying about the Force for years. But the way it lands, after all the weight TFA had placed on the question, feels deflating to many viewers, and it set up a reversal in Rise of Skywalker that retroactively makes TLJ's answer feel like misdirection rather than a meaningful choice. I want to be fair to what The Last Jedi does well, because it does quite a lot well. The Force bond between Rey and Kylo Ren, the ability to see and hear each other across the galaxy, is inventive and emotionally rich. The film develops it with real care, and the throne room sequence, where they fight back-to-back against Snoke's guards, is the best action filmmaking in the entire sequel trilogy. The choreography, the relationship dynamics, the revelation of what each character means to the other, at that moment, all work together beautifully. The Holdo maneuver, where Vice Admiral Holdo steers a ship into the First Order fleet at light speed, is one of the most striking images in all of Star Wars. Just silence for a moment, and then a white slash of light through the darkness. The sound dropping out entirely. It's one of those images that stays with you. Luke's final scene, projecting himself across the galaxy through the Force so that the Resistance can escape, is genuinely moving if you can accept the version of Luke being presented. The image of him sitting on Ahch-To in the twin sunlight, letting himself dissolve into the Force with a small, peaceful smile. Whatever you think of the journey to that moment, the moment itself has a beauty to it. The Canto Bight section, I should mention, is less successful. The casino planet, the war profiteers, the subplot involving Finn and Rose, and the codebreaker DJ. It introduces a theme about the systemic corruption underlying the galactic conflict, about how the rich profit from war regardless of which side wins, and then doesn't develop that theme into anything that substantively affects the plot. Even people who are broadly sympathetic to The Last Jedi tend to go a bit quiet when Canto Bight comes up. The film could have been shorter and stronger without it, but set that aside. The deeper problem with The Last Jedi as a piece of a trilogy is structural rather than qualitative. By the end of the film, Snoke is dead without explanation. The Resistance is reduced to a handful of survivors in a single ship. Luke is gone. And several of the questions TFA raised have been answered in ways that a large portion of the audience found unsatisfying. The person who comes back for Episode 9 is going to inherit a situation where the previous film has made choices that feel, to many people, like they need to be reversed. And that's a difficult position to make good films from. Something I want to note about The Last Jedi's reception that doesn't get quite enough attention The film's audience score of 42% was almost certainly influenced by coordinated negative review campaigns in ways that made it look worse than a true organic audience response would have. Several film critics and journalists documented evidence of bot activity and coordinated review bombing on audience score aggregators around the time of TLJ's release. This doesn't mean the film was universally loved. It clearly wasn't. There is a real audience that genuinely disliked it. But the raw number of 42% may not accurately reflect the actual distribution of audience opinion, which was probably something more like evenly split. I mention this not to defend the film, but because I think clarity about what the data actually means matters when you're trying to understand what went wrong. The sequel trilogy discourse has been shaped by numbers that are at least partly artifacts of how online opinion can be manipulated, and it's worth keeping that in mind. What I find more interesting than the discourse around TLJ is the question of what it reveals about the different things people want from a Star Wars film. There appears to be a fairly deep division between people who want Star Wars to be a mythology that keeps building on itself, that surprises you, that challenges what you thought you knew, and people who want Star Wars to be a mythology that feels consistent, that honours what it has established, that gives you the thing you know you love in new forms. Both of those are legitimate desires, and I think the sequel trilogy got caught in the crossfire between them, with TFA satisfying the second group, and TLJ trying to satisfy the first group, and TROS trying to satisfy both simultaneously and not quite managing it. The result was a discourse that, at its peak, felt genuinely toxic. That's probably the most damaging legacy of the sequel trilogy. Not the box office decline, which the franchise can recover from, not the narrative inconsistencies which future films can work around, but the sense that Star Wars had become a site of genuine cultural conflict, where liking or disliking a particular film meant something about who you were. That toxicity is still present, still lingering, and it's the thing I hope the next chapter of the franchise manages to move past. There's a pattern that runs through the Disney-era Star Wars productions that exists somewhat separately from the films themselves, and which I think is worth examining in its own right. A pattern of creative friction between filmmakers and Lucasfilm, of directors departing under difficult circumstances, being replaced mid-production, being sidelined in post. It happened with a notable frequency during the Kennedy era, frequently enough that it stopped looking like bad luck and started looking like something structural. It doesn't apply to all of them, I should say. Rian Johnson made The Last Jedi without reported incident, by all accounts. He and Kennedy had a good working relationship. He was given the creative freedom he wanted, and he used it to make the film he wanted to make, with the results we've discussed. That's worth noting. It's not the case that Lucasfilm under Kennedy was systematically incapable of working with directors, but several high-profile cases went differently. The first significant one was Rogue One, a Star Wars story released in December 2016. Gareth Edwards directed it, but during post-production, Lucasfilm brought in writer and director Tony Gilroy to oversee significant reshoots. Edwards remained the credited director. He didn't publicly describe his experience as a firing, but the scale of Gilroy's involvement and the degree to which the finished film apparently differed from what Edwards had made was debated for years afterward. The Rogue One we saw in cinemas was, by many accounts, substantially different from Edwards' cut. The curious thing is that Rogue One turned out well. It's one of the most well-regarded entries in the Disney-era catalogue. Critics liked it. Audiences liked it. It holds up. So in terms of the finished product, the intervention worked. But it established something about how Lucasfilm was willing to operate, and about the control the studio would exercise over productions it felt weren't going in the right direction. Solo, a Star Wars story, is a more dramatic case, and one I find genuinely fascinating in a slightly melancholy way. Phil Lord and Christopher Miller were announced as directors of a Han Solo origin film in June 2015. Their track record was excellent. The Lego Movie is a funny, clever, inventive piece of work. The Jump Street films are sharp and self-aware. They had a specific comedic sensibility, an energy, a willingness to let actors improvise and experiment and find things in the moment that weren't in the script. And someone at Lucasfilm decided that quality was what the Han Solo film needed. What Lucasfilm wanted, as it turned out, was for Lord and Miller to add a comedic touch to a Han Solo film, which is not quite the same thing as hiring comedic filmmakers and letting them make a comedy film. The difference between those two briefs is significant. Production began in January 2017 at Pinewood Studios. Things went wrong fairly quickly. Lawrence Kasdan, who had co-written the script with his son Jonathan, and who had an extensive history with Star Wars going back to The Empire Strikes Back, was on set and was reportedly unhappy with the direction things were taking. Lord and Miller were encouraging improvisation in ways that were departing from his script. They were shooting fewer camera setups than Lucasfilm had expected, which was creating problems in the editing room. Kathleen Kennedy was not pleased with what she was seeing in the dailies. And when Kathleen Kennedy is not pleased with what she's seeing in the dailies, things tend to move fairly quickly. There was a fairly telling incident that apparently became a flashpoint. Lord and Miller were shooting in the Millennium Falcon cockpit and used 3 camera setups over the course of a day. Lucasfilm had expected somewhere between 12 and 15. The gap between what Lucasfilm wanted and what the directors were delivering had become by then too large to bridge. In June 2017, roughly 6 months into principal photography, Lord and Miller were fired. Lucasfilm cited creative differences. Ron Howard, who had long-standing connections to Lucas going back to American Graffiti, was brought in to take over. Howard is not a filmmaker you associate with wild creative swings, which was probably exactly the point at that stage. He oversaw reshoots covering a very significant portion of the finished film, and the budget grew to nearly $300 million. Solo, a Star Wars story, eventually earned $393 million worldwide, making it the first Star Wars film in the Disney era to lose money in theatrical release. Lord and Miller, when they eventually spoke publicly about the experience, said they had felt deeply misunderstood. They'd come into the project believing they were being hired to make a comedy film. Lucasfilm had apparently imagined they were being hired to add lightness to a Star Wars film. These are genuinely different jobs. I find this story sad, if I'm honest. Not catastrophic, not a great injustice, but sad. Lord and Miller are talented filmmakers. The idea of what they might have made, given the freedom to actually make their version of the Han Solo story, is interesting to think about. Instead, what happened was a situation where nobody's version of the film fully got made, and the result was a film that felt a bit like it was having an argument with itself about what it wanted to be. The most directly relevant case to the sequel trilogy, though, is Colin Trevorrow. Trevorrow had directed Jurassic World in 2015, which was a massive commercial success, despite being a fairly divisive film critically. He was announced in August 2015 as the director of Episode 9, with the expectation that he would develop the story from where The Last Jedi left it. He began working on the screenplay with his writing partner Derek Connolly. They delivered their first draft to Lucasfilm in December 2016. The script was titled Duel of the Fates. 11 days after that, on December 27, 2016, Carrie Fisher died. Fisher was a central figure in the Duel of the Fates script. Her death required significant changes. Trevorrow and Connolly produced revised drafts, then more revised drafts. None of them fully satisfied Lucasfilm. In August 2017, screenwriter Jack Thorne was brought in to give the material another pass. That didn't resolve the issues either. In September 2017, Colin Trevorrow departed from Episode 9. Lucasfilm cited creative differences. Reports suggested there had been significant friction between Trevorrow and Kennedy, though the precise nature of the disagreements was never fully disclosed. J.J. Abrams was then brought back to direct. What this pattern suggests, looked at as a whole, is a studio that was uncertain about what it wanted, that was hiring filmmakers with distinctive voices, and then struggling to accommodate what those filmmakers actually made, and that was making major decisions under time and financial pressure without the structural support, the story bibles, the creative consensus that might have made those decisions less fraught. I want to be careful about assigning blame too neatly here. The situation was complicated, and most of the full story isn't public. But I think the contrast with what came afterward is instructive. When Jon Favreau and Dave Filoni made The Mandalorian, which launched on Disney Plus in November 2019, the result was something that both critics and audiences responded to with genuine warmth. And I think part of the reason for that is that Favreau and Filoni have an extensive, deep-lived knowledge of Star Wars as a mythology. They know what the franchise is and what it means. They were making something from genuine affection and knowledge of the material, in a format, television, that gave them more time and flexibility without the weight of concluding a 50-year saga pressing down on every choice. Kathleen Kennedy stepped down from Lucasfilm in early 2025. She was replaced by Dave Filoni and Lin Brennan. The change in leadership suggests a different approach going forward. What that approach produces remains to be seen, but the pattern of the Kennedy era and the contrast with what Filoni and Favreau made together does tell you something about what makes Star Wars work and what makes it not work. One thing I find worth sitting with about the Lord and Miller situation specifically is the question of what the films they might have made would have looked like. Lord and Miller's comedy sensibility is not cheap or easy. The Lego Movie is a film that works on multiple levels simultaneously. That's funny and self-aware, and also, unexpectedly, emotionally affecting in its final act. 21 Jump Street works because it's aware of exactly what it is and uses that awareness as a comedic tool. These are filmmakers who understood character and subtext and the gap between what people say and what they mean. A Han Solo film made by those sensibilities, given real creative freedom, might have been fascinating. Something genuinely different from the rest of the franchise. We'll never know, What we got instead is a Solo that feels at times slightly uncertain of its own tone. There are sequences that feel like Lord and Miller's work, looser and funnier, sitting alongside sequences that feel like Howard's work, more classical and controlled. The two approaches don't always reconcile, and while the finished film is by no means bad, it's a film that feels like it survived something rather than a film that had a clear vision and executed it. The deeper question the pattern raises is about what kind of creative environment Lucasfilm was in the Kennedy era. It appears to have been one where the studio had strong opinions about what a Star Wars film should be, and where filmmakers who arrived with equally strong but different opinions found it difficult to maintain their vision. That's not necessarily wrong. The studio's job is to protect the franchise. But the franchise also needs filmmakers who are genuinely making something, not simply delivering a product to a brief. The best Star Wars has always felt like it came from somewhere, like it was made by people with a specific perspective. The director carousel years suggest a studio struggling to reconcile those two things. Dave Filoni's long relationship with the franchise, his deep understanding of the mythology and the characters, meant that when he and Favreau made The Mandalorian, there was no tension between what the studio wanted and what the filmmakers were making. They were the same thing. That alignment is probably the most important lesson the Kennedy era teaches, and I think it's the lesson the current Lucasfilm leadership is trying to apply going forward. J.J. Abrams returning for Episode 9 was, in itself, a kind of statement about the state of things. You don't call your opening director back to close out a trilogy when everything has gone smoothly. You call your opening director back when the alternative feels too uncertain to risk. It speaks to a certain desperation, or perhaps just practicality, that Abrams was the choice. He knew these characters. He knew what he'd set up. He'd have the most invested understanding of what the trilogy needed to accomplish. The problem was that the trilogy, by this point, had been partially dismantled by the film in the middle, and Abrams was going to have to conclude something that had been going in two different directions at once. The Rise of Skywalker had an extraordinary amount to accomplish: conclude a trilogy, provide emotional resolutions for characters who had been inconsistently developed across 3 films, deal with the loss of Carrie Fisher, navigate the tensions between audiences who had hated The Last Jedi and the people who had loved it, and do all of this in a single film with approximately 18 months between Abrams being hired and the release date. Let's start with Carrie Fisher. Fisher passed away in December 2016. The decision was made, and I think it was the right decision emotionally, even if it created significant practical constraints. Not to recast Leia or remove her from the story digitally, but to use archival footage from previous productions and find scenes within the new story that she could fit into. Abrams and the creative team spent considerable time combing through footage from earlier films and finding usable moments. The result is handled with more care than it might have been. There are moments, particularly a scene where Leia reaches out through the Force toward her son, that carry a genuine emotional charge that is inseparable from knowing this was the last time we'd see her. But it also constrained the narrative significantly. Leia's role in Rise of Skywalker is necessarily limited to what archival footage could provide, and you can sometimes feel the structural accommodations the film is making around her absence. Then there's the matter of Palpatine. The opening crawl of The Rise of Skywalker contains the line, "The dead speak. The galaxy has heard a mysterious broadcast, a message of terror from a shadow. Somehow, Palpatine returned." Emperor Palpatine, killed definitively at the end of Return of the Jedi, is back. The film's first scene shows him. Then, a few minutes into the film, a character announces in dialogue that Palpatine has returned, which creates the slightly unusual situation of announcing something in the opening crawl and then announcing it again in case the crawl wasn't clear. The film never fully explains how he's alive. There are oblique references to Sith alchemy and the ability to cheat death. The dark side of the Force is a pathway to many abilities some consider to be unnatural, Palpatine says at one point, which is exactly what he said in Revenge of the Sith, and which is not technically an explanation of the mechanism. Various pieces of expanded universe media would later attempt to fill in the details. The film itself doesn't try. I want to be fair here. Bringing Palpatine back is not inherently a bad idea. He is the saga's most significant villain. There's something symmetrical about having him present in its conclusion, and Ian McDiarmid, returning to the role, is clearly having the time of his life. But the way it's introduced, dropped into the opening crawl as a fait accompli, without setup in the previous films and without in-film explanation, creates a sense of something being imported from outside the story. It's the kind of plot development that's difficult to make feel earned when it hasn't been built toward. The pace of Rise of Skywalker is its other significant structural problem. The film barely stops moving. Location to location, revelation to revelation, action sequence to action sequence, without the breathing room that would let any of it settle. There are moments that should feel significant but don't quite, because the film hasn't given you the space to sit with them. A character is apparently killed, and then alive again several times, to the point where the stakes of any particular jeopardy become difficult to take seriously. This is partly a consequence of how much the film needed to accomplish. But Abrams also has a particular filmmaking instinct toward momentum and spectacle, and in a film that needed to slow down and breathe, that instinct worked against it. The most structurally significant thing Rise of Skywalker does, in terms of the trilogy as a whole, is walk back a series of choices the last Jedi had made. Rey's parents, revealed in TLJ to be nobody important, are now revealed to be the children of Emperor Palpatine. Rey is his granddaughter. This directly inverts what Johnson had established, and it means that anyone who invested in TLJ's answer now has that investment retroactively invalidated. Snoke, killed in TLJ before anyone explained who he was, is retroactively explained as a creation of Palpatine, something engineered. This provides a belated answer to TFA's question, but it's an answer that arrives in a different film, at a moment when the plot is already moving very fast and it lands with less weight than it should. Rose Tycho, who had a substantial role in the last JDI as a new protagonist, appears in Rise of Skywalker for a few brief scenes at the beginning and then essentially disappears from the story. The contrast with her role in TLJ is stark. John Boyega, who played Finn, was publicly critical of this after Rise of Skywalker's release. He said the studio had given all the nuance to the white leads. He talked about how Finn had been built up in The Force Awakens and then progressively sidelined as the trilogy went on, and about how he and other actors of colour had been moved to the edges. He said this clearly and directly, and I think he was right to say it. Finn's arc is worth tracing specifically. He begins with a premise that's one of the most interesting in the trilogy: a stormtrooper trained from childhood to serve the First Order, who defects because he can't bring himself to participate in a massacre. He has no name, only a designation. He finds a name. He begins to find out who he is outside of the only life he's been trained for. He has a vague Force sensitivity. He ends the trilogy with that arc essentially unresolved, in a final scene where he tries to tell Rey something important and doesn't get to say it. The Trevorrow script, as we'll discuss in a later section, had him leading a stormtrooper rebellion on Coruscant, which would have been the natural culmination of everything TFA had set up. What we got instead was a character diminished by the structure of the films he was in. Then there's the question of Rey's identity, which is where the film makes its boldest choice. Rey Palpatine, by the film's end reconsidered to become Rey Skywalker. The decision to make Rey the granddaughter of Emperor Palpatine is interesting for what it reveals about what Rise of Skywalker thought the problem with TLJ was. Johnson had argued, through the nobody reveal, that heroism doesn't require bloodlines. The Force belongs to anyone. Rise of Skywalker disagreed, or at least felt that the audience needed a more significant answer. So Rey gets a heritage, and the heritage is Palpatine. There's a certain thematic logic to it. Kylo Ren is the grandson of Darth Vader, darkness that contains light. Rey is the granddaughter of Palpatine, light that came from darkness. The symmetry is clean. She ultimately rejects the Palpatine identity, calls herself Rey Skywalker at the film's close, and buries the two Skywalker lightsabers in the sand of Tatooine as the twin suns set. As an ending image, it works. I find it genuinely moving, actually. The problem is the journey that gets there, which feels rushed and reactive in ways that the image itself can't fully compensate for. The film's critical response was 51% on Rotten Tomatoes from critics and 86% from the audience. This is almost the exact inverse of the last Jedi split, which had been warmly received by critics and contested by audiences. The film pleased the portion of the audience that had been most upset by Johnson's choices. Critics found it less satisfying. The trilogy's box office tells its own story. The Force Awakens made over $2 billion. The Last Jedi made $1.33 billion. The Rise of Skywalker made approximately $1.07 billion. Each film earned substantially less than the one before it. The franchise that had launched with the kind of excitement and financial performance that looked like an unlimited future had over 4 years and 3 films been significantly reduced. The Skywalker saga was over. The question of what came next would take several more years to begin to answer. There are some individual moments in Rise of Skywalker that I think deserve acknowledgement, even in a section that's largely accounting for the film's structural failures. The sequence where Rey and Kylo Ren fight across a crashing ocean on the ruins of the second Death Star is visually impressive. The staging is difficult and the choreography is committed. There's a moment where Kylo heals the wound he's just inflicted on Rey using Force healing, and the way the two actors play that scene, the confusion and the exhaustion and the thing that can't quite be called tenderness, is well done. The finale, where the voices of past Jedi speak to Rey, has a quality to it that I find moving in a way I can't entirely justify rationally. You hear Yoda and OHB-1 and Anakin and Ahsoka and Kanan Jarrus from Rebels and others. The accumulation of them, the sense of a tradition speaking through its individual voices, is effective. It's one of those moments where the franchise's accumulated weight works in the film's favour. Kylo Ren's redemption is, as I mentioned when talking about the characters, the best developed arc in the trilogy. His conversation with a memory of Han Solo in the ruins of the Death Star is quietly excellent. It's not a complex scene. Han appears, they talk briefly, Han says, "I know," and Kylo throws away his lightsaber. But Driver and Ford play it with such mutual understanding that it works. The callback to Han's "I know" from Empire gives it an emotional resonance it earns. What I can't quite reconcile, and what I don't think the film fully reconciles either, is the relationship between Rey and Kylo in the film's final act. They fight. He heals her, and she doesn't stop his heart from failing. She kisses him. He dies. This happens very quickly, in an extremely busy final act, and the emotional logic of it feels compressed in ways that the film doesn't have time to unpack. The relationship across 3 films has been building toward something. What that something should have been, I'm not sure. What it is in the film feels like a rushed version of something more complex. The other thing worth noting about Rise of Skywalker is how visually inventive it is, even when the story is struggling. The film looks extraordinary. Pasaana, the desert festival planet, the water moon, the ancient Sith world of Exegol, vast and industrial and ominous. Whoever the production design team was, they were working at a very high level. The film's failure isn't a failure of craft in any technical sense. It's a failure of story, which is a more important failure, but it's worth being precise about where the problem is. I keep thinking about what this film might have been with a different set of constraints. Give Abrams 18 months of genuine creative development time, free from the pressure of reversing TLJ's choices. Let him build toward the conclusion he actually wanted, rather than the conclusion the marketing department needed. Let him develop Finn's arc and Poe's arc and the Rey/Kylo relationship in ways that had room to breathe. The results might have been quite different, but that's not the film we got, and I think part of making peace with it, as I said, is accepting it for what it is rather than permanently mourning what it might have been. One of the things I keep coming back to when I think about the sequel trilogy as a whole is the gap between who these characters were supposed to be and who they ended up being. Not because of any failure of casting or performance, the cast across all 3 films is excellent. It's a structural failure, a consequence of making a trilogy without a plan, where each film was making its own decisions about what these characters needed to do. And those decisions didn't always accumulate into coherent arcs. Let me go through them because I think they all deserve a bit of honest attention. Finn is, for me, the most clear example of what got away. He begins with one of the most interesting premises in the entire saga. He is a First Order stormtrooper, trained from birth, who decides during the opening minutes of The Force Awakens that he cannot participate in a massacre. He watches his units slaughter civilians, and he simply can't make himself do it. He freezes. He's never had a name, only a designation, FN2187. He finds a name. He defects from the only life he's ever known, without a plan, without allies, without any clear sense of who he is outside of the thing he was trained to be. This is a genuinely rich character idea. The question of what your identity is when you've been stripped of the one you were given, when you've rejected the only world you knew, and have to build yourself from scratch, is interesting material. TFA develops it reasonably well in its first act. Finn is funny, warm, scared, adaptable, instinctively decent. John Boyega plays him with enormous natural likability and a quality of emotional transparency that makes you want good things for him. In The Last Jedi, Finn and Rose go to a casino planet, are caught by the First Order, escape with the help of a morally ambiguous hacker, and return to the Resistance in time for the final battle. Rose stops Finn from a self-sacrificial act and tells him they have to save what they love instead of fighting what they hate. It's a sentiment I find quite touching, actually. But Finn's arc across TLJ is mostly in service of themes rather than character development. In Rise of Skywalker, Finn has a vague Force sensitivity that's mentioned briefly and then dropped. He runs alongside the other characters for most of the film. He tries to tell Rey something important in the climax and is interrupted, and the film never returns to it. His story ends without resolution. John Boyega's comments after the film's release were honest and clearly came from a real place. He talked about how the character had been built up in the marketing for TFA and then progressively moved toward the margins as the trilogy progressed. He talked about characters of colour being given less to do. These observations were made publicly, clearly, and I think they're accurate. The Trevorrow script, which we'll discuss separately, had Finn leading a stormtrooper rebellion on K-Ho-U-Sant, using a Jedi beacon to call the galaxy to resistance. That's the endpoint his arc was pointing toward. That's where the logic of his character led. The trilogy didn't get him there. Kelly Marie Tran's Rose Tico is another difficult story to sit with. She was introduced in The Last Jedi as a ground-level resistance maintenance worker who becomes, accidentally, a protagonist. She's the first major woman of colour to feature prominently in a Star Wars film, which matters. She was also targeted by a harassment campaign from a portion of the fan base who objected to her character or to her prominence in the film. Tran deleted her social media in 2018 after the abuse became sustained and intense. Rise of Skywalker then reduced her to a handful of brief scenes at the margins. Whatever narrative reason was given for this internally, the optics of the timing are troubling. I don't want to overstate the causal claim because I don't know the full story of why those decisions were made, but I know what it looked like from the outside, and it looked bad. Oscar Isaac's Poe Dameron is a character study in wasted potential, though it's harder to be sad about Poe because Isaac's charm makes the thin material more than it is. Poe is an excellent pilot who acts on instinct. By the end of Rise of Skywalker, Poe is a slightly more measured pilot who acts on instinct and who has become a leader, though the process of becoming one is largely told rather than shown. The chemistry Isaac has with Boyega and Ridley is real and warming, and it carries scenes that the writing alone wouldn't. But Poe never gets the arc his talent deserved. Kylo Ren, or Ben Solo, is the exception. He gets the most complete journey of any of the new characters, and Adam Driver's commitment to the role across all three films is remarkable. The anguished, volatile quality he brings to Kylo in TFA, the complex evolution in TLJ, where he becomes arguably the most interesting figure in the trilogy. The brief redemption in Tross, it's a coherent arc, and Driver plays every stage of it with specificity and intelligence. The Rey/Kylo dynamic is the closest thing the sequel trilogy has to a consistent emotional centre, and it's the part of the trilogy I find myself thinking about most fondly. And Rey. Daisy Ridley is, film by film, more impressive than the character she's being asked to play. Her performance is more consistent than Rey's identity, which shifts from nobody to pal pew teen granddaughter across 3 films, and which is handled differently by each of the 3 directors. Ridley never stops being present and specific and human, even when the script is pulling the character in directions that don't quite cohere. It's a genuine performance in films that didn't always deserve it. The ensemble problem, the thing that sits underneath all of these individual observations, is that the main trio of Rey, Finn and Poe don't spend enough time together in any of the 3 films for their relationships to develop properly. The original trilogy worked in part because Luke and Han and Leia were almost always together, their dynamics constantly evolving, their friendships and tensions and loyalties built up across 3 films in sustained company. The sequel trilogy's central characters feel more like they're each in their own separate story that occasionally intersects. That's a structural failure, ultimately. Another consequence of 3 films made without an agreed plan for who these people were and how they related to each other. There's another dimension to the character problem that I want to mention, which is the romance question. The sequel trilogy sets up several possible romantic pairings across its runtime, and then doesn't fully develop any of them. Finn and Rey have a warmth and easy chemistry in The Force Awakens that could have been built into something. Instead, the later films fold her into an entirely different dynamic with Kylo Ren, and don't return to what Finn and Rey were to each other. Finn and Rose have a connection in TLJ that the film develops with some care, and then Rise of Skywalker essentially forgets. Poe Dameron doesn't have a romantic arc of any kind across 3 films, and the Rey/Kylo dynamic, which is the most developed emotional relationship in the trilogy, ends with a kiss that arrives so quickly in such a packed final act that it doesn't have time to feel like the culmination it's supposed to be. A story about young people at the centre of a galactic conflict has embedded in it natural opportunities for the kind of human emotional stakes that make you care about who survives. Those opportunities were only partially used. I also want to say something about the central trio problem more specifically. Rey, Finn and Poe are nominally the core of the new trilogy, in the way Luke, Han and Leia were the core of the original. But the original trio spent almost all of the original trilogy in close proximity to each other. Their relationships evolved through sustained shared experience. By the time of Return of the Jedi, you understood how each of them related to the others, what they meant to each other, what they each saw in the other 2. Rey, Finn and Poe are together in the same room for meaningful periods of screen time in exactly 1 film, Rise of Skywalker. And even there, much of the film is spent in motion rather than in the kind of quieter scenes where character relationships actually develop. They never quite get to be the trio the films want them to be. Their friendship is asserted more than it's earned. That's a loss. The actors, as I've said, are good enough that you can feel what the relationship could have been. You can see Ridley and Boyega's easy rapport, hear the specific way Isaac and Boyega play off each other. There's enough there to want more of it. The fact that the films didn't give them more of it is one of the sequel trilogy's more quietly sad failures. There's an alternate history of the sequel trilogy that begins with Disney looking at the treatments Lucas had spent years developing and deciding to use them as the foundation for what came next. We'll never know exactly what that version would have been, but we know enough about Lucas's plans to spend some time with it, and I find that genuinely worth doing. The clearest picture we have comes from James Cameron's documentary series, Story of Science Fiction, made for AMC around 2018, in which Lucas speaks at some length about what he'd been planning. He described a trilogy centred on a young female Jedi being brought to Luke for training. He described the tone as more ethereal than what we got. He described an interest in the deeper metaphysical dimensions of the Force in the microbiotic world that the Phantom Menace had introduced with midichlorians, and that subsequent films had largely left alone. That last detail is interesting, because midichlorians remain one of the most contested ideas in Star Wars fandom. The concept that the Force has a biological, measurable component bothered a lot of people who felt it demystified something that should remain mysterious. Lucas was, apparently, planning to demystify it further, to go deeper into what the Force actually is at that level. Whether that would have been good filmmaking, I'm not able to say with certainty. It might have been wonderful. It might have been the kind of thing that produced 10 more years of argument. Most likely both. What I can say is that it would have been distinctive. It would have been continuing the project Lucas had been working on across 6 films, taking the mythology somewhere genuinely new rather than back to something familiar. In the Charlie Rose interview, after he'd seen The Force Awakens, Lucas said the film had nothing new. He felt Abrams had made something backward-looking, something more interested in recreating the feeling of the original trilogy than in extending the mythology. And I think this is a real point of view worth taking seriously, even if you think The Force Awakens is a better film than what Lucas would have made. Lucas has always understood Star Wars as a series of experiments. Each film was trying to do something different. The original trilogy told the story of a young man finding his place in a galaxy at war and his father's redemption. The prequel trilogy told a political tragedy, a story of how a republic falls and how a good man becomes a monster. Lucas never set out to make 6 of the same thing. The Force Awakens, by his account, was 6 of the same thing. It was a new hope with new faces, and he'd never wanted that. There's an irony here that I find quite rich. The fan base that had spent the prequel years criticising Lucas, saying he'd lost what made Star Wars good, saying the films were too political and too weird and too interested in things audiences didn't want, was the same fan base Disney was trying to win back with the sequel trilogy. And in trying to please those fans, Disney made something that Lucas found deeply unsatisfying. He got what he always got, the criticism of the fans who wanted something he didn't want to give them, and the disapproval of his creation being used in ways he didn't intend. It's quite sad when you look at it that way. And here's something else worth sitting with. One of the last Jedi's central ideas, the anyone can be a hero argument, the notion that the Force isn't about bloodlines, that the next Jedi can come from anywhere, is actually not so far from what Lucas himself had been saying for years. The prequel trilogy is fundamentally about the dangers of predestination. Anakin is supposed to be the chosen one. The Jedi have a prophecy, and the prophecy leads them to train someone who destroys them. Lucas's point across the prequels is that the Force doesn't work like a fairy tale. Being chosen doesn't make you safe from corruption. The power of the Force is a responsibility, not a guarantee. The idea that Rey's heroism doesn't come from lineage, that she doesn't need to be a Skywalker to matter, is actually compatible with the Lucas version of Star Wars. Johnson's instinct and Lucas's instinct were closer on this particular point than the culture war around the sequel trilogy might suggest. The tragedy is that Johnson was working within a framework that had already abandoned Lucas's outlines, so the question of how they would have fit together is largely speculative. What we're left with is a counterfactual. Lucas's sequels would have been slower, more spiritual, more inwardly focused than what we got. They might have been great. They might have been another round of the prequel argument, a generation of fans who felt their Star Wars had been taken from them and replaced with something strange. Most probably some version of both, but they would have been something. They would have been a continuation, not a repetition. I find myself returning to a phrase Lucas used in one of his interviews about the sale, about what he felt he was handing over. He said he was handing over his children. That's a strange and loaded thing to say, and he later regretted saying it in those terms. But it gets at something real. These films were not, to Lucas, simply a product or a franchise or an intellectual property. They were a decades-long creative project, a mythology he had built. And when that mythology was handed to people who saw it differently, the result was something that looked like his creation and wasn't quite. That's a genuinely melancholy thing to contemplate at this time of night. Something else worth considering about the Lucas treatments is the question of what they would have meant for the original trilogy characters. Lucas, in what we know of his outlines, apparently had a specific vision for each of them. Luke as the withdrawn mentor whose limitations are part of his teaching. Leia as a political leader who had carried the weight of the resistance for decades. Han as someone who had found a settled place in the world. The sequel trilogy's decision to regress these characters, to strip away their post-return of the Jedi lives and return them to earlier, less resolved versions of themselves, was one of its more contested choices. Harrison Ford has been saying for decades that he wanted Han Solo killed off. So Han dying in TFA was, in a sense, a fulfillment of Ford's long-standing wish. But the version of Han we see before he dies, back to smuggling, estranged from everything his arc had given him, feels like more of a regression than a development. Lucas's version would presumably have honoured the 30 years between Jedi and the sequel films. His characters would have been people shaped by their history, carrying it with them in ways that informed who they'd become. That's a different storytelling choice, and not necessarily an easier one, but it respects the audience's investment in who these people became. The prequel question is also relevant here. Lucas's sequels were, in some sense, building on the prequels as well as the originals. The midichlorian concept, the Jedi Order's history, the political structures of the Republic, all of it was live material that his sequels could have built on. The sequel trilogy, by contrast, largely set the prequels aside. They're never mentioned. Kin Skywalker's story, which Lucas spent 3 films telling, barely appears in the Disney sequels. Which is interesting, because by the time TFA came out, the prequel trilogy's critical reputation was shifting. The generation of fans who grew up with those films were adults, and they were reconsidering them with the kind of affection that comes from having a work be part of your formative experience. The memes, the appreciation for Ewan McGregor's performance, the renewed interest in the Clone Wars series, the prequels were being rehabilitated. A sequel trilogy that engaged with the prequel era, that built on what those films had established, rather than treating them as something to move past, might have found a way to honour all 3 trilogies as a connected story. That was always Lucas's vision, a 9-film saga, all connected, all part of the same long arc. What we got instead was a trilogy that looked to 1977 for its inspiration, rather than to the full scope of what had been built since. That was a choice. You can argue it was the right one for 2015, but it meant the sequel trilogy was working with a version of Star Wars that was deliberately incomplete. In January 2020, a few weeks after the rise of Skywalker had come out to the kind of mixed reception it got, something appeared online that prompted a fairly significant conversation. Colin Trevorrow's screenplay for Episode 9, the film he was attached to direct before his departure, leaked to the internet. Trevorrow confirmed it was authentic, and then a great many people read it. The script is dated December 16th, 2016, 11 days before Carrie Fisher died. It's a first draft, clearly not a finished shooting script, and the events of December 27th would have required substantial revision regardless. All of that needs to be held in mind. But with those caveats in place, it's quite interesting. The title, Duel of the Fates, is taken from John Williams' piece that plays over the Darth Maul fight in The Phantom Menace. It's one of the most recognisable pieces in the entire franchise. Trevorrow chose it not as a reference to that fight specifically, but to suggest something larger. Not a duel between 2 people, but a conflict between 2 possible futures for the galaxy. 2 different versions of what comes next. The opening crawl describes a different situation from Rise of Skywalker. The First Order, under Supreme Leader Kylo Ren, has imposed a communications blackout across the galaxy. Most systems are under occupation. The Resistance, led by General Leia Organa, is planning a mission. There is no resurrected Palpatine. Kylo Ren is the main villain. The story follows directly and organically from where The Last Jedi left it. Coruscant appears, the galactic capital that featured prominently in the prequel trilogy and was entirely absent from the sequel trilogy films, plays a significant role here. It's under First Order occupation. Parts of it are grim and dilapidated, the grandeur of the Republic era visible only in ruins. A young boy named Dade moves through the city, providing a ground-level perspective on what the First Order's control actually looks like for ordinary people living under it. Finn and Rose are given a substantial storyline. They're working to ignite a stormtrooper rebellion on Coruscant using a Jedi beacon buried in the ruins of the old Jedi Temple to send a signal that calls the galaxy to resistance. Think about what that means for Finn's arc specifically. The stormtrooper who defected, who refused to participate in a massacre, who spent the first two films finding out who he is outside of the life he was given, is now leading others to make the same choice he made. That's the natural culmination of everything TFA set up. It's the story his character was always pointing toward. Rey and Kylo Ren are both searching for something called Mortis, an ancient, Force-sensitive location that features in a story arc from the Clone Wars animated series. The Mortis storyline from that series deals with the fundamental nature of the Force, with light and dark and balance in ways that connect quite directly to the broader mythology. Using it here would have been a genuine callback to the wider Star Wars universe and a way of developing the Force mythology in ways that felt earned. Kylo finds Mortis first and encounters a 7,000-year-old Force user who trained Darth Plagueis, Palpatine's master. He learns to drain Force energy from living things. Rey learns to take things from the dark side without being consumed by it. Their confrontation, when it comes, is shaped by these abilities. Rey's surname, revealed by Kylo Ren as he's dying, is Solana. Not Palpatine, not Skywalker. Solana. She comes from nobody in particular. She earns her own name. The ending is significantly different from Rise of Skywalker. Kylo drains the Force from Rey, leaving her near death. Leia, in her last act, reaches through the Force to her son and uses what remains of her strength to turn him back to himself. Ben Solo, restored, heals Rey at the cost of his own life. He dies as himself, not as Kylo Ren. Rey survives. Later, we see her on a small peaceful planet called Modesta, training a new generation of Jedi alongside Finn and Rose. The galaxy is free. The story has a resolution that feels earned by the events of the films before it. When the script leaked, the critical response was interesting. It was described positively, quite broadly. Journalists who read it noted that it felt like a real sequel to The Last Jedi, that it built on what Johnson had done rather than reversing it, that it gave the supporting characters something substantial to do, that it had a structure and an ambition that felt coherent. John Boyega saw the concept art that was released alongside it and called it dope. He said he couldn't bring himself to read the full script because he'd be too heartbroken about what wasn't made. I want to be careful about what I'm saying here, though. I want to say it clearly. This is a first draft, a screenplay dated December 2016, written before Carrie Fisher died, before Johnson had even finished shooting The Last Jedi, before a great deal of the development work that normally precedes a finished film had been done. The version of the film we imagine when we read this script is missing a year of revision, production design, casting decisions, whatever notes Johnson had for continuity, and whatever Trevorrow and Connolly would have refined in subsequent drafts. That's a lot. And yet, as a document of what the story might have been, It's worth sitting with. It suggests a path through the trilogy that was coherent, that honoured what the previous films had established, and that gave the new characters the endings their arcs were pointing toward. Whether that path would have produced a great film, a good film, a mediocre film, or another divisive film, I don't know. Probably some version of something. It's a road not taken. Those are always a bit haunted. Let me spend a bit more time on some of the specific creative choices in Duel of the Fates, because I think they illuminate what a different version of the sequel trilogy might have valued. The decision to set significant portions of the film on Keor-U-Sant is quite interesting. Keor-U-Sant is one of the most elaborately realised planets in the saga, and its absence from the sequel trilogy always felt slightly like a deliberate distancing from the prequel era. Bringing it back, under First Order occupation, scarred and partly ruined, would have been a way of connecting all three trilogies. The city that represented the Republic's grandeur in the prequels, now a symbol of what authoritarian control does to civilization. That's a coherent visual metaphor. The Mortis storyline from the Clone Wars is another deliberate connection. The Mortis arc, for those unfamiliar, is a 3-episode sequence in the animated series where Anakin, OHB-1, and Ahsoka encounter a place that exists outside normal space and time, inhabited by 3 Force wielders who embody aspects of the Force itself. It's one of the most ambitious pieces of Star Wars storytelling outside the films, and it deals directly with questions about the balance of the Force and what that actually means. Bringing that mythology into a film sequel would have been a serious piece of franchise building. There's also a quality to the Trevorrow script's moral logic that I find more satisfying than what we got. The core of Duel of the Fates seems to be about whether the galaxy can be free without heroic individuals fighting for it, about whether ordinary people, stormtroopers in Finn's case, maintenance workers in Rose's, can be the ones who change things. That's actually a democratic argument about heroism that connects to something real. The galaxy isn't saved by a chosen one, or a bloodline, or even by the resistance. It's saved because enough ordinary people decide to resist. That's a different answer to the question, how does the story end, than what Rise of Skywalker gives us. TROS ends with Rey defeating Palpatine by absorbing all the Jedi power that has ever existed as a cosmic chosen one moment. DOTF, at least in outline, was apparently going to end with the galaxy's people choosing something different. One of those endings feels more true to what Star Wars, at its best, is saying. The question of whether Trevorrow would have directed a great film from this script remains genuinely open. Jurassic World is a workmanlike blockbuster, with a strong opening and a somewhat mechanical second half. He's not an obviously inspired filmmaker, but the ideas in the script are interesting enough that I find myself wishing the experiment had been run. The specific failures of the sequel trilogy are easy enough to list. The choices that didn't work, the reversals and unanswered questions and sidelined characters. But those are symptoms, not causes. The cause is something simpler and more fundamental. The sequel trilogy was made without an agreed story, not without talent, not without resources, not without creative ambition, but without a map. 3 directors, 3 films, no agreed destination, no shared understanding of what the trilogy was trying to say or where it needed to end up. I want to dwell on this for a moment because I think it's easy to let it slide past without appreciating how unusual it is for a production of this scale to proceed this way. The kind of planning infrastructure that makes long-form storytelling cohere, the shared story bibles, the creative roadmaps, the agreed destination, was exactly what the sequel trilogy didn't have. The decision was made fairly early that giving creative filmmakers genuine freedom was more important than that kind of structure. And I understand the thinking. Nobody wanted the sequel trilogy to feel like it had been made by committee. They wanted distinctive filmmakers making distinctive films. The problem is that this is an approach that works for standalone films and doesn't work for a connected trilogy, because the choices one director makes create the conditions the next director has to work in. Without an agreed destination, without a clear sense of what the trilogy is moving toward, those choices compound in ways nobody can fully anticipate. You end up with TFA opening questions that TLJ answers in unexpected ways, and then TROS spending half its runtime trying to reverse TLJ's answers, and the whole thing feeling less like a planned story than like three people each trying to fix what the previous person did, which is more or less what it was. The fan service versus subversion tension is the same problem expressed differently. TFA decided the best approach was to recreate the feel of the original trilogy. TLJ decided the best approach was to push against that nostalgia and find something new. TROS decided the best approach was to give the audience who'd been alienated by TLJ what they were asking for. Each of those decisions makes some sense in isolation. Together, they produce incoherence. Then there's the commercial pressure, which I don't think gets enough attention in discussions of what went wrong. Disney's initial plan was for the franchise to produce annual releases. The main trilogy films, plus anthology films, plus whatever came next. A Star Wars film every year. This was ambitious, possibly too ambitious, and Solo's disappointing box office showed why. It came out less than 6 months after The Last Jedi. Audiences who had been divided by TLJ and who were still processing how they felt about it were being asked to go back to the cinema for another Star Wars film very quickly. The market couldn't absorb that pace. After Solo's poor performance, the anthology program was effectively suspended. Several planned projects were cancelled or went into indefinite development. Disney CEO Bob Iger acknowledged in 2020 that they had probably released too many Star Wars films too quickly. The correction that followed, slowing down the theatrical releases and moving toward television with The Man du Law Yun, was the right one. But it came too late to help the sequel trilogy. And then there's the question of what Lucasfilm was, structurally, equipped to do. Kennedy was an experienced and accomplished film producer. The track record before Lucasfilm speaks for itself. But producing a connected franchise universe requires a different kind of organisation than producing individual films. It requires story infrastructure, shared creative bibles, long-term planning, the kind of institutional knowledge that Marvel took years to build. Lucasfilm, in the time available between the Disney acquisition and The Force Awakens' release, didn't have time to build that infrastructure. The Filoni-Favreau contrast is instructive. When Favreau and Filoni made the Man du Law Yun, they worked from a position of deep franchise knowledge and genuine creative alignment. They knew what Star Wars was, they cared about it in specific and detailed ways, and they were making something that sat within the mythology rather than concluding it, which meant the pressure was different. The Man du Law Yun didn't have to end the Skywalker saga. It just had to tell a good story in the Star Wars universe. That's a more sustainable creative position. I want to be careful not to assign blame too neatly. The situation was complicated. The pressures were real. The decisions that were made, most of them, made some sense at the time they were made. Kennedy is not a villain in this story. Abrams is not a villain. Johnson is not a villain. The directors who were fired or who departed were working in difficult circumstances. What went wrong, fundamentally, is that nobody sat down before production began on Episode 7 with all the relevant people in the room and asked the question, what is this trilogy about? Where does it end? And what do each of the 3 films need to accomplish to get there? If that question had been asked and answered, almost everything else would have been different. It's a simple observation, and possibly a slightly annoying one in its simplicity. Big creative failures often have simple explanations at their core. The complications pile on top of them, but underneath it all is usually something fairly basic that went wrong early and was never fixed. There's a conversation I keep imagining that never happened, somewhere in late 2012 or early 2013, shortly after the Disney acquisition was announced and before the first script meeting for TFA. A conversation where someone, Kathleen Kennedy or Bob Iger, or someone with the authority to shape what came next, sat down with a whiteboard and asked, "What is this trilogy about?" Not, "What's the first film about?" What is the entire trilogy about? What question is it asking? What does it want to say about the Force, about heroism, about the Skywalker legacy, about the galaxy these characters live in? What does Episode 9 look like? Who is alive at the end? What has changed? If that conversation had happened and produced answers that everyone building the trilogy shared, most of what went wrong could have been avoided. Rian Johnson would have known, going in, that Snoke needed to survive, because he was going to be explained in Episode 9, or Abrams would have known, going in, that Snoke was going to be killed because Johnson had a specific plan for what that meant, one or the other, but not both discovering incompatible plans when it was too late. The thing about narrative planning in long-form storytelling is that it doesn't constrain creativity. Good planning enables creativity because it gives individual creators the freedom to be inventive within the shape of the story without accidentally breaking things the next person needs. What it constrains is the particular kind of creative freedom that means each filmmaker is making their own separate film rather than a chapter in a shared story. There's a relevant analogy in television which is interesting to think about. The best long-form television has a combination of showrunner vision and writer room collaboration that produces both creative variety and narrative coherence. The writers can take episodes in interesting directions because the showrunner knows where the season ends. That structure is exactly what the sequel trilogy was missing. A showrunner, someone whose job was the story as a whole, who could hold all three films in their head simultaneously and guide each director toward their piece of the larger picture. Instead, what the sequel trilogy had was three separate auteurs, each making their own film, connected only by a shared cast and a franchise name. And the result is a trilogy that feels like three people finishing each other's sentences in a language they don't entirely share. The audience fragmentation this produced is, I think, a direct consequence. The audience for TFA and the audience for TLJ were measurably not the same people. TFA brought back the fans who loved the original trilogy and wanted to feel 12 years old again. TLJ challenged those fans and brought in a different audience who valued the film's ambition. TROS tried to win back the TFA audience and lost a portion of the TLJ audience in the process. You end up with a trilogy that has three different audiences rather than one cohesive one, and none of those audiences is fully satisfied. The Solo underperformance compounded this. When a Star Wars film loses money, it creates institutional anxiety. Decisions get made faster, with less patience for creative risk. The very things that might have helped the trilogy find its way, given the time and space to work through the structural problems, were foreclosed by commercial pressure. What I find when I look at the whole picture is not a story of incompetence or malice exactly. It's a story of an institution trying to do something very hard without the structures it needed to do it well. And those structures take time to build. Marvel took years before the MCU became the reliable machine it became. Pixar's success with sequels came from years of institutional culture that built the habits and values that make their storytelling work. Lucasfilm didn't have that time. They had 2.5 years from acquisition announcement to release of the first film. That's almost certainly the foundational problem, the one that everything else flows from. The timeline was too aggressive, the pressure was too immediate, and in the rush to get Star Wars back into cinemas, the things that needed time, the planning, the creative infrastructure, the story Bible, were the things that got cut. I want to be fair here, not just technically fair, not the kind of fairness that's a fig leaf for sustained criticism. where you acknowledge some strengths and then get back to what you actually think. I mean actually sitting with what works. Because quite a few things work, and this part of the conversation deserves the same attention as the rest of it. The performances across all three films are consistently better than the films sometimes deserve. Daisy Ridley brings something specific and real to Rey in every scene she's in, even when the character's identity is being revised around her. There's a watchfulness to her Rey, a quality of someone who has learned to be very still and very careful, that feels consistent across all three films, regardless of which director is working with her. That kind of continuity, maintained through three different filmmaking visions, comes from the performer. Adam Driver's work as Kylo Ren is remarkable throughout, and I want to say so clearly. The peculiar anguished quality he brings to the character, the way Kylo always seems to be fighting against himself as much as against anyone else, is a specific and intelligent performance choice. The scene in TLJ where he tells Rey her parents don't matter, and for a moment you can't be sure whether he's telling her the truth, or trying to isolate her, or actually connecting with her, or all three at once, is one of the finest pieces of acting in the entire franchise. Driver commits fully, every time, in a way that elevates everything around him. Mark Hamill's work in The Last Jedi deserves a sentence. Whatever you think of what Johnson does with Luke's character, Hamill plays the man with complete honesty and specificity. The weariness, the self-disgust, the flickers of the person he used to be are all there. The final scene is genuinely moving, partly because Hamill earns every frame of it. And Carrie Fisher. Across all three films, she brings a grace and a complexity to Leia that goes beyond simple nostalgia. She plays the character's age and authority in ways that feel entirely natural. There's a line in The Force Awakens, just her face when she embraces Rey, rather than Chewbacca after Han's death, wordless, that says something true about grief and attention, and what we reach for. Small moments, but they add up. The visuals are genuinely beautiful throughout the trilogy. This is consistently inventive filmmaking at the technical level. The Salt Planet crate in TLJ, that white surface with red crystal underneath, revealed in streaks and splashes as the speeders move across it, is one of the most striking visual ideas in any Star Wars film. The water moon of Kef Bir in Rise of Skywalker, the ruins of the second Death Star, half submerged in crashing waves, has a scale and a melancholy to it that's effective. The throne room sequence in TLJ is beautifully staged. The first shot of the Resistance fleet in hyperspace in TFA, tiny against the absolute darkness, is a good image. The whole trilogy looks like care was taken. John Williams' scores deserve specific acknowledgement. His work across all three films is excellent, and Rey's theme, introduced in The Force Awakens, is one of the finest new themes he's written in decades. It has that quality which the best film music has, of seeming to have always existed. Of course, this is what Rey sounds like. The TLJ score has passages of genuine beauty, particularly around the sequences involving the Force connection. The music, across all three films, is doing what Star Wars music has always done, emotional heavy lifting that the images alone couldn't carry. The Force mythology has some genuinely interesting additions. The Force bond between Rey and Kylo, the ability to see and hear each other across the galaxy, is an inventive development of Force capability that the films use well, particularly in TLJ. The Holdo maneuver, a ship going to light speed directly through the First Order fleet, is one of those ideas that, once introduced, becomes part of the mythology permanently. Future Star Wars productions will use it and reference it, and that's probably a net positive for the franchise. The Force healing concept from TROS opens questions about the Force's capabilities that would be interesting to explore further, and Luke's Force projection in TLJ is a brilliant idea. The most powerful Jedi in the galaxy at the end of his strength, deciding to spend everything he has left to give someone else a chance to escape. Not fighting, not destroying, saving what he loves. The fact that it kills him is what gives it its weight. It's a meaningful death for a character who might have had a less meaningful one. The honest verdict, as I've been sitting with it tonight, is this. These are not terrible films. They are, individually, reasonably entertaining, occasionally beautiful, sometimes moving, full of good work by good people. What they are not, as a unit, is a trilogy. The whole is less than the sum of its parts, and the reason for that is structural, not qualitative. It's a story that was made without an agreed destination, and you can feel the absence of that destination in every film. That's a specific kind of failure, and I find I can hold it alongside all the things these films got right, and let both things be true at once. I want to spend a bit of time on "and," or specifically, because I think it proves something important about the Star Wars franchise's potential that has a direct bearing on everything we've been talking about tonight. And or isn't part of the sequel trilogy. It's a prequel series set before Rogue One, but I'm mentioning it because it demonstrates, more clearly than anything else in the Disney era, what happens when a Star Wars production is given the time and creative freedom to be genuinely excellent rather than commercially safe. Tony Gilroy, who took over Rogue One's reshoots in circumstances of some chaos, was given the keys to a television series and produced something that most critics and audiences consider one of the finest things Disney has ever put out. It's a political thriller. It's about how ordinary people arrive at resistance. It has time to let its characters exist without constant action. It trusts its audience. The sequel trilogy, in its best moments, has some of the same qualities. It's just that the best moments are less consistent and less free. And/or is what the sequel trilogy was trying to be, in places, in circumstances that allowed for it. There's also something worth saying about what the sequel trilogy did for the franchise in terms of audience expansion. The Force Awakens, whatever its structural problems, introduced Star Wars to a generation of young viewers who hadn't grown up with the original films. Daisy Ridley's Rey became, for many of them, their entry point into the mythology, in the same way Luke was for the generation that saw A New Hope in 1977. That's worth something. Quite a lot, actually. Whatever critical verdict you arrive at about these three films, the Star Wars universe they helped expand is one that now includes people who found the franchise through Rey's story. Those people will carry something of Star Wars with them the way every generation that encountered it young has done. The sequel trilogy's cultural impact, its ability to make new Star Wars fans, is real and should be counted alongside its narrative failures. And the performances, I keep coming back to the performances. The first generation of Star Wars actors, the Hamill and Ford and Fisher generation, had something alchemical in how they worked together. It took time to see it, actually. A New Hope has charm, but it's The Empire Strikes Back, where you feel the full weight of what those three people are doing together. The new cast didn't get as long to develop their alchemy. But what you can see in the scenes where they're together and the material gives them something to work with suggests it was there. That's the thing I come back to, ultimately. These films had the ingredients, they had the performers, they had the technology, they had the mythology to draw on. What they lacked was the structure to put it all together. And that makes what they did achieve, within those constraints, genuinely impressive in its own right. There's a moment at the very end of The Last Jedi that I find myself thinking about more than almost anything else in the sequel trilogy. After everything that's happened in the film, after the throne room and the battles and Luke's projection and all the rest of it, the film cuts to a different planet entirely, a casino planet stable at night. A group of children who work there, effectively slaves of the wealthy patrons, have been told the story of what Luke Skywalker did, of how one man stood alone on a salt flat and held off the First Order long enough for the resistance to escape. One of the children sweeps his hand and a broom lifts toward him, drawn by the Force. The final shot is him standing in a doorway, holding the broom like a lightsaber, looking up at the stars. I think about that image quite a lot. because it gets at something true about what Star Wars actually is. Myths don't end. Stories that mean something don't end. They get told and retold. They pass from person to person, changing a little each time, carrying something forward. The point of a mythology isn't to conclude, it's to keep being told. The sequel trilogy tried to end the Skywalker saga, and it did end it, in a formal sense. The Crawl of Rise of Skywalker says Episode 9, and that's the last numbered episode. But Star Wars continues. It was always going to continue. There are new films in development. Simon Kinberg, announced in late 2024, is developing a new trilogy that is said to align more closely with Lucas's original ideas for what came after Return of the Jedi. Dave Filoni is now Chief Creative Officer at Lucasfilm, which suggests the franchise is in the hands of someone who understands it at a deep and detailed level. The Mayen de Law Un and Gro Gu film is in production, and or exists, which is as good an argument as any that Star Wars can be genuinely excellent television when the right people are making it. The saga continues, as sagas tend to. I find I've arrived over the course of tonight at something like genuine peace with the sequel trilogy. Not the peace of indifference, where you stop caring and therefore stop being troubled, more the peace of perspective. These films tried to do something very hard. They failed in specific, traceable ways. They also produced, along the way, performances and images and musical themes and individual moments that I expect I'll carry with me for a long time. The first time I heard Rey's theme, Adam Driver's face in the throne room, the silence before the Holdo maneuver, Mark Hamill sitting on a rock in the first twin sunset light. These things are real. They exist regardless of the structural problems around them, and I'm glad they exist. I'm also glad we had tonight to wander through it all. There's something satisfying about thinking through a complicated thing at an easy pace, without urgency, without needing to arrive at a verdict that settles anything. The sequel trilogy is worth thinking about. The questions it raises, about how to continue beloved things, about what a franchise owes to its mythology, about the gap between creative freedom and creative coherence, are questions that come up in a lot of places and don't have simple answers. I've been thinking about doing something on the prequel trilogy next, which has its own very different and quite fascinating story. Of production and ambition, and a creator insisting on a vision that his audience wasn't ready for, and of a critical reappraisal that's been happening slowly and interestingly over the past decade. That might be a good one for another night. I've been thinking, as we've moved through all of this tonight, about what it means to care about something and also to be able to see it clearly, because I think that's what the sequel trilogy tests in people who love Star Wars. It tests whether you can hold both things at once. Affection and honest assessment, investment and perspective. The people who are angriest about these films are, I think, people who care the most. That sounds patronising, but I mean it with some seriousness. You don't spend 8 years in ongoing argument about 3 films, unless those films matter to you in some deep way. The argument is a form of engagement. It's proof that Star Wars still has the power to make people feel something. The people who love The Last Jedi feel genuinely betrayed that something bold and interesting was partially walked back. The people who hated it feel that something they love was misunderstood and mishandled. Both of those feelings are real. Both of them come from caring. I find at this hour that I mostly just want to sit with the things I like about these films without needing to resolve the argument. Rey running through Jakku at the start of TFA, her whole situation communicated wordlessly in a few minutes. The way the force bond between her and Kylo works, the intimacy and the danger of it simultaneously. Luke's last scene, the accumulated voices of all those Jedi in Rise of Skywalker, John Williams' score under all of it. I also find I want to sit with a sense of hopefulness about what comes next. Filoni and Favreau have shown that the franchise can produce something genuinely excellent when the right people are in charge and the creative conditions are right. Andor has shown that Star Wars can be genuinely great television. The fact that new films are being developed with apparent attention to the Lucas mythology that the sequels set aside suggests at least a possibility that what comes next will learn from what went wrong. Star Wars has always been a story about hope in the most literal sense. It says so in the episode title, and I think the mythology is resilient enough, and beloved enough, and strange enough to keep producing interesting things. The sequel trilogy is a chapter, not the final word. Right, that's enough from me for one night. Thank you for spending some time here. If you find yourself drifting off somewhere in the middle of all that, I'll consider that a success of sorts. Sleep